Hey, Batman Ultra 7 here. It's been a while since I've made a video, and I think you're gonna like this one. It's a little different than usual, and I'm very passionate about what I'm about to talk about. I love comics. I've been in love with the art form for as long as I can remember. For as long as I can remember, I've been a comic book fan. From the post-apocalyptic adventures of Commandy, the last boy on Earth, the science fiction rebellion war against Baron Karza and the Micronauts, the tag team superheroic adventures of the Brave and the Bold, and cross-country road trip across America of two superheroes, where the lefty Green Archer brings a space cop down to Earth. I love these stories more than I can even describe in this video. I love everything from strange tales to action comics. And as I am older now, the days of going to the comic shop in Washington buying issues of Batman Adventures are seemingly behind me. I want to further embrace a part of me that some would leave behind. TODD MCFARLANE is incredibly famous for his groundbreaking run on the webhead in the 90s, bringing us one of the most lasting villains of his rogues gallery. So lasting, Aviarad won't shut up about it. Todd is also famous for his businessman spirit, but we're not talking about either of those for this video. We're talking about Todd's greatest creation, in my opinion, Spawn. TODD MCFARLANE crashing onto the comic book scene in the late 1980s, immediately catching fire with his incredible, dark, hyper-detailed art, which first gave life to his Spider-Man, as well as the brand new popular villain at the time, Venom. McFarlane's art is famous for how dark, super detailed, at the same time very edgy, which was what comic book writers were asking for at the time, in the big muscles and even bigger guns comic book era of the 90s. Now, how did we get here? Image was born out of a simple idea: break the rules. The comic book industry and industrialization of an art was built very simply to give the world an escape to a colorful world of comic booky glee and superheroics. But the big two from which the industry had sprung, the two which at one time were the underdogs, had become the suits. When Todd McFarlane came into Marvel, he revolutionized the Spider-Man book, gave it new life through his art, and how he could tell a story, because McFarlane wanted to break the rules of what a comic book had to be, because it doesn't have to be anything except a story told through comic art. No matter your opinion on the man, Todd McFarlane was, is, and always shall be a force to be reckoned with in the comic book industry. And I don't think that the industry would be the way it is without him and the rest of Image, building the foundations of what it means to make independent comic books. When the united creative forces of Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Wuchi Portacio, Mark Silvestri, and Jim Valentino joined together and spawned Image Comics in 1992, there was a palpable shift in the comic book industry. You could feel it because these were a bunch of huge creative forces at the time, working at Marvel that up and left and created their own indie comics company, and it had such an effect that Marvel's stock fell $3.25 in shares when the news became public. That's big, frankly. 7 of the highest selling creatives at Marvel going off on their own, and that was only the beginning. The guys at Image were mavericks, the rock stars of the comic book world, and everybody was watching. waiting for what they were about to do, and no one could have guessed what was about to happen. Spawn may not have been the first character or comic book that Image produced, but it's certainly the most important, and Al Simmons would soon become the flagship hero of Image Comics. Spawn is indicative of the trend that the guys at Image were bringing to the table. Something new, changing the status quo.
The one thing I tell kids at college, my wife teaches at a college and I go and speak, is that really the greatest, thickest, and highest wall that I think all of us will ever run into is the wall of the status quo, which basically means that people are, for whatever reason, adverse to change, even though it's really the only constant in life. But we cling to keeping things the same because nobody wants to take a chance. So those of us that are wired, myself included, to take those chances and want to take those chances, you can either look at it from your perspective or go, okay, Todd, you accomplished something. You did some things that were out of the box and they were successful. Or you can say, you know, I was a rebel, I was uncoachable, I was immature, or I was whatever. I don't care what negative word you want to use. There's a fine line between being tenacious and stubborn and then just not being a nice person.
Spawn, when you get down to it, at its very essential heart, is a man trying to return to who he loves. And that's true of Todd McFarlane's motivations in founding Image. Spawn is the image of indie comics because near the end of McFarlane's time at Marvel, there was a clear creative friction between the artists/writers and the higher-ups. The first issue of McFarlane's Spider-Man run sold like hotcakes, one of the best-selling comics of all time at the time, at 2.5 million copies sold. Marvel would be lucky to have sales that good right now. Despite this, the higher-ups of Marvel were uneasy about the rule-breaking style of McFarlane's art and general storytelling, wanting him to just keep peddling the same Spidey they had been for his entire history. Todd wanted change, therefore, Spawn.
So, for me, Ted, when we started Image Comics, I only wanted to write at the beginning for one reason. Not because I had a lot of stories to tell, but because I had a lot of visuals in my head that I wanted to get on paper. And as a byproduct, those were my stories. I knew that there was going to be no other writer that was able to see what was in my brain or the images that were in my brain that I wanted to get on paper. And so I go, there's only one way to get there. I must start writing my own stuff.
The story of Al Simmons begins with the end of his life, but also the beginning of something else, Spawn. And in the same way, in a very real way, Todd McFarlane's career really began when his work at Marvel was cut short, because Image spawned the independent comic book market, and my life wouldn't be the same without it.
I remember there was someone to love, someone to hate, and I was something special and proud of it for a time. And they turned on me. He turned on me. I remember dying.
This is where Al Simmons is at. At the beginning of his story, seemingly the ending of life, the beginning of Spawn. Al Simmons' descent from hell. Al Simmons, now Spawn, devoid of any of his memories of his life on Earth, besides contextless images of his wife, the only person that can know him. He has no idea who she is, but he knows she means something to him.
The advantage that they have is that they've created stories in which, even though one of those three writers has this backdrop of the fantastic, they've created these stories where they put a lot of normality into those conversations, because they know every second doesn't have to be someone beating someone up or shooting a ray gun. When those moments are gone, whether you look like an alien, or you're a zombie hunter, or you're Superman, there are moments of respite in which you want to just have a normal conversation. I think you can do it in ways that are not heavy-handed.
McFarlane very much establishes what he values and wants in a character, and those values shine in Spawn. A very flawed protagonist with the classic 90s qualities of spikes and chains, but being very three-dimensional in his character development of a demon who wants to know who he is again, and wants to get back to his wife, which is really a beautiful story in its fantastical grotesqueness, showing a transparency of what the real world is through a gothic lens. When Todd McFarlane was creating Spawn in the 90s, he wasn't just creating a single character. The creation of Spawn, I feel, is very unique compared to the creation of other titans of the comic book world. When Batman was created, by Bill Finger, not Bob Kane, none of the mythos and world building was there, not even the core essentials of Batman was there. Thanks to Bill Finger, we got to them as we went along, but it took time. Same with Superman. Superman couldn't even fly in his first years, nor did he have certain other qualities till they were introduced via alternative sources like the Fleischer Superman cartoons or the Superman radio show, contributing to the mythos. Todd McFarlane was building the world of Spawn from the very first issue. And even deeper than the world, McFarlane was developing Al Simmons' very soul and inner morals that would drive him to do what he does through the pages of the comic book. Something that McFarlane was always very interested in with the character of Spawn is making this undead demon Spawn condemned to a body and soul that is damned to hell. And innately, very simply, human.
We tend to just want to get to the fun stuff, if you will, the kinetic stuff, and we don't put the humanity into it. I've tried, whether right or wrong, to keep the human part of the Spawn world and Al Simmons himself, who is Spawn, at the forefront. Then all the fighting is almost a complication to doing that. If you were to say, Todd, in the first 3, 4, or 5 months of the introduction of the Spawn comic book in 1992, talk to me about Spawn, I could probably talk to you for about 20 minutes. If you now say that at 20 years later, or even 10 years later, or 5 years later from the introduction of that book, hey, talk to us about Spawn, I could go on for hours. I mean hours and hours and hours. Why? Because not only do you get comfortable with the characters, but you also start getting comfortable with their motivation. Then you start almost giving personality to them, and you know how each one of them should or are going to react in certain situations. You start giving reasons as to why everybody's doing what they're doing. The next thing you know, you don't have to put all that on the page. You can just have it in the back of your head so it makes some sort of sense to you when you're putting it in and constructing your stories. Writing is no different than learning the language. The more you do it, the better you get. It's impossible for me to think that any person could say, hey, I'm going to write 1,000 pages, and by halfway through that story, page 500 wouldn't be much better constructed on all levels than pages 1 through 10.
McFarlane very simply knew going in that what he wanted to do with this character in his world in a much more in-depth way compared to the comics creators of the past. But despite that know-how, he really knew when to take feedback from the fans and comics readers and apply it to his own book. For one, after some people complained about his writing ability, he brought in comic book legends like Neil Gaiman, who wrote Sandman, Dave Sim, who wrote Cerebus, and Grant Morrison, who wrote All-Star Superman and so much more, to write issues of the comic, as well as later down the line hiring Greg Capullo, longtime collaborator of Scott Snyder, as a guest artist at first, then became a regular artist down the line. I think one of the most admirable things about the Spawn comic and McFarlane as an artist/writer is that at the beginning of each Spawn issue is a dedication to a comic book legend, whether it be Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, etc. A specifically important and defining component of the success of Image and Spawn is Todd McFarlane's businessman spirit being the ultimate salesman of a comic book legend, which was very important in putting Image on the map.
I think humans are just flawed, and we think of ourselves as way more than we really are. We're just another flawed animal. We just happen to have higher thinking, flawed as it is, but now we can use those flaws to literally tell limitless stories.
I think this tenet really shines through in Spawn and in the book's cast of characters, because McFarlane tells a very authentic and vulnerable story about a very damaged and dirty world with dirty politicians and greedy mobsters not too different from demons. In a world not different from our own, the real world through the lens of a demon-damned man who misses his wife. Al Simmons isn't some pure idealistic hero either. He's not Superman. He's not Captain America. He's a very flawed man. His life shattered because of his increasing morality as an assassin for the CIA. He's attacked by his own director, who hired Simmons' best friend to kill him and send him to hell. He was killed because he was a good man. He makes a deal with the devil to return home to Earth as a hellSPAWN to see his wife one last time. But Spawn is returned to Earth with barely any of his memories, as we very well know. As he learns more about his powers, and that if he runs out of his powers, he will be returned to hell. He decides to use as little of his power as possible and fight mobsters on the street, as well as other gutter trash who seek to hurt innocent people. Earlier this year, the Spawn series reached issue 300 of its run, this being an accomplishment like nothing in comics till this point. This is incredibly important for two reasons. Spawn is now the longest running independent comic book series, and the longest the same creator has worked on their own comic book. Finally, I'll leave you with a quote from Todd McFarlane.
Whatever direction you went, and I'm not saying any of those stories is better or worse, people who think they can't tell stories are not giving themselves enough credit, because each of us lives thousands of stories, every year, and all you have to do is just tap into a couple of them. The ones you tell when you're at a dinner party or with your friends, just tell that story in a magnificent fashion.
Tell your story. No matter the form, tell it. Make a YouTube video. Write a novel. Make a comic book. Draw it. Have someone write it. Use your passion. Make a movie. Whatever your passion be, tell your story. It doesn't even have to be art. Just in whatever you do, tell your story. Todd McFarlane did with a little anti-hero called Spawn, and he became the image of indie comics.